Hello, everybody, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Today, finally, we are continuing on with our Player's Guide series, and as I promised, I've whipped up and put together an interesting fighter build for you all today. Now, again, as I stated before, this is not the be-all, the end-all. These guides are meant to more just give you tips, tricks, advice, insight, maybe give you different suggestions on things to try for your different characters and your various character builds. And these can easily apply as NPC builds as well too, particularly if you're looking to build a potentially significant character for the players to interact with. But since today we're focused mostly on players, like I said, this is mostly just about helping all of us out when we're trying to face down that big, bad, scary-ass GM. Anyways, since it's an interesting fighter build today, why don't we go ahead and just dive right on into it. Alright, and here we are with that build. For the interesting fighter build today, I went with the Elven race for this particular character. It's, again, mechanically speaking, it is not the most optimal choice. The race does get a +2 bonus to their dexterity and intelligence scores, but they take a -2 penalty to their constitution, which affects their hit points and their fortitude saves. But they do get an immunity to sleep effects and a +2 save bonus versus enchantments for their will saves, which is actually kind of big. It's really good to get any help that you can on your will saves. That's one of the biggest weak points of the fighter class, is they tend to have a lower willpower, except for where fear effects are concerned, thanks to their class abilities. In addition to some various other bonuses, the most relevant one to this particular build is their bonus to perception, which is another +2 bonus. Elves are pretty good at noticing things, hearing things, searching for things. You know, that classic trope of the elven race is being just preternaturally perceptive of the world around them and the goings-on. But let's go ahead and get down into the brass tacks here. For this particular build, I kind of assumed rolled out stats, and I gave a pretty decent array here. For this, I went with a lower strength score of 16. The dexterity score is 18, with the boost from the +2 bonus to dexterity. Their constitution is 14, counting in their penalty to constitution. Intelligence gets bumped up to a 12. Wisdom I've left at 12, and charisma, as always, is the dump stat. We're not too worried about this character being friendly or chatty with people. In fact, the way I picture this character playing out is, again, that kind of classic elvish trope of them being aloof, all-knowing, kind of know-it-all, smarmy douchebags in some cases. And in this particular case, this character's charisma score reflects that. This person is not interested in making friends. They are focused on whatever their duty may be, or whatever task or personal interest they have on hand, depending on the character's alignment, how you play out their personality, etc., etc. All the roleplay stuff. But that means their character gets 12 hit points. Starting off, they have a fortitude save of 4, which ain't too bad at all for first level, even with the constitution penalty there. Their reflex saves, thanks to their high dex bonus, gets bumped up, and that's really useful for fighters as well, especially when it comes to enemy wizards or casters, throwing out damage-dealing spells like Fireball, Thunderbolt, anything like that. These reflex saves will help reduce the amount of damage that character takes, if they're successful. Will saves, like I said, this is kind of one of the big weak points for the fighter class. There's only a 1 here, but thanks to this +2 bonus save versus enchantments, so that's any spells that might make them friends of an enemy caster, anything that may affect their mind and alter how cognitively they're processing things, that will help out and bump that up to a 3 there in that case, which is, again, useful. It's really good to have this played a session running as a DM, actually, where the NPC fighter with the group had an enchantment spell cast on him, and the rest of the party didn't realize, and so he got a surprise round on them and dealt a significant amount of damage to a couple of party members before they were able to get a handle on the situation. Now, since this character has a higher dexterity score, I went ahead and started them off with a chain shirt as far as armor goes. Reason for that being heavier armors limit the amount of your character's dexterity bonus you can make use of. So since I wanted to make use of every point and starting off generally just going straight by the rules in the book, characters have a relatively limited amount of money, I figured a chain shirt would be more than sufficient coupled with the dexterity here, giving them an armor class of 18. That's not as high as it possibly could be. Shield would help boost that more. But I went ahead and took a little bit of a page from the previous fighter build and gave this fighter a two-handed weapon. In this case, the glaive gisarm. I'm probably butchering that and will continue to butcher that, but we'll just dive right into it. In this case, they have a +4 bonus total to their attack, and the glaive gisarm does 1d10 plus 4 points of damage. So roll a d10, add +4 on top of it, and we get the +4 because strength of 16 gives us a +3 strength modifier that we can apply to damage, and two-handed weapons, as we covered before, get a 1.5 strength bonus for their damage. Unfortunately, we have to round down, so half of 3 is 1.5. Round down, that's a 1, so we get +4 damage there. Now, the glaive, unfortunately, does not have a high crit range. It only has a chance of rolling a critical hit on a 20 on the 20-sided die, but it does do ×3 damage. So if we take a look at our minimums, average, and maximums here, we'll do a minimum of 5 damage with this character per hit, maximum of 14. We average out around 9-ish points of damage, or so technically 9.5, but again, rounding down just for the sake of simplicity. So average amount of damage is 9 on a ×3 crit. That's 27 points of damage. Now, we get to the part where this build is interesting, and as always with fighters, that comes down to your feat selection and your equipment. The glaive gisarm I picked because it is a reach weapon. What that means is that the character can affect opponents further away. Normally, characters only affect everything in a 5-foot square around them. 5-foot radius around them in all these various squares. This is a 5x5 square that the character occupies. Sorry, not 5x5. Anyways, but with the glaive, they can reach out further and affect a much wider area. So they can attack people from further away, and anybody passing through this area that isn't taking time to make a 5-foot step. In other words, they're being careful and covering themselves and protecting themselves as they pass through the area the character can affect. They get an attack of opportunity made against them by the character. So if somebody just rushes through, that character gets to take a free hit on them. But because this character is an elf and has such a high dexterity score because of that, the combat reflexes feat does wonders for this character. Normally, a character may make 1 attack of opportunity per round. With combat reflexes, they can make a number of attacks of opportunity equal to their dexterity bonus. So in this case, the character can make 4 attacks of opportunity. That means any given round, potentially, this character can make 5 total attacks at first level. And with that reach weapon, they're more likely to be able to do that since they can affect a much wider area than normal. They have a great deal of opportunity of making those extra attacks and putting out more damage, even though they have a lower strength score, even though they are dealing with a weapon that only rolls 1 die for damage rather than 2 dice, like we see with the greatsword, doing 2d6 points of damage. So even though it's a lesser amount of damage per hit, this character can throw out more hits. And just to add more on top of that, I gave them the cleave feat. So say they're already engaged with an opponent, and opponent 2 runs through their threatened area. As they're running through, although cleave does require them to be adjacent, you can make an argument that with the reach weapon they're more easily able to do this. Certainly I've allowed similar things before. As this character passes through that threatened area, they make their attack, and then if they hit, they can make a free cleave attack against their second target. So it goes from potentially 5 attacks in a round to possibly having 10 attacks total at level 1. Again, there's a little bit of assuming your DM will let you get away with some of this, but I figure it's easy enough, and even then, even if not, you're still making extra attacks of opportunity. So at minimum, you're looking at a potential of 5 attacks per round. Now, with this character, for their recommended skills, we have our usual array of perception, swim, and then we have acrobatics here. Acrobatics is actually something particularly useful because with this skill, this character, if they want to move through a space that their opponent is threatening or occupying, they use their acrobatic skill to tumble through without provoking an attack of opportunity, meaning the player can move from here to here without getting hit back, and puts themselves in a position where they are potentially affecting more targets, which, starting off, because this is not a class skill for the fighter, it's something outside the normal array of training for fighters typically. You're not going to be able to develop this much early on, but as you level up, as long as you keep putting points into it as you can, this will make things really helpful and make this particular maneuver a lot easier later on. And, of course, this build only gets better as they level up. I've set everything up for level 10 here, and, of course, I've listed mostly the changes that are affected here. The strength score gets bumped up to 18, because every 4 levels, a character gets 1 point that they can put into their stats. So by bumping our strength, we bump our attack bonus, and we bump the damage that we do. And since strength is multiplied 1.5 times for using a 2-handed weapon, this just gets even better. Dexterity and the other stats have stayed mostly the same. I just gave average hit point levels or level ups to this character, so their hit points are at 102. Their fortitude saves go up to a +9. And thanks, fighters, for developing your fortitude so much. Reflexes up to a +7, which, again, that's mostly due to the dexterity score providing such a benefit here. And then will saves are a 4. Again, not great, but it's nice having that +2 bonus that gets thrown in anytime the fighter's facing down enchantments, and they're also immune to sleep effects, given that, at least again, as most of the standard tropes and things go for elves, they only have to meditate for 4 hours. They don't actually sleep. Initiative, we have a total of 8 now, up from our +4 that we get from the +4 dexterity modifier. Now, the character's armor class goes up to 21. In this case, they have the standard 10 everybody gets, +4 from their dexterity, +7 from armor. In this case, I gave them a +1 mithril breastplate. Mithril has an interesting effect when it comes to armor. It treats the armor as if it were one category lighter. Typically, you have light, medium, and heavy armor. Having the armor made out of mithril means heavy goes down to being treated as medium, and medium goes down to being treated as light armor. Light armor doesn't really get too much in the way of benefit from it. It also cuts the weight of the armor down in half, which is just fantastic. The character still has to be proficient in the armor category, so just because technically the heavy armor is treated as medium armor for weight purposes, they still have to have training for wearing the heavy armor. So think twice before you start throwing mithril breastplate on your rogues. They need the training first, otherwise they start taking penalties. It's a mess. The glaive disarm goes to a +1 weapon of speed. Speed, as I mentioned before, gives us an extra attack here, which just makes this so much more fun. And the damage goes up to 1d10 + 9 from a couple of different sources, including the bump in strength there. The crit range stays the same, but most importantly, our minimums, average, and maximums go to minimum of 10, maximum of 19, average of 14 points of damage per hit. And remember, we're doing at least 5 hits per round, if not 10, if we're dealing with a significant number of enemies, little characters that swarm and the like. Now, just because it is such a good feat, regardless of builds for fighters and barbarians, any character really that gets in and mixes things up in melee, I selected power attack here because, look at that. We get an extra 6 points of damage out of this because we're using a two-handed weapon and we're using the power attack feat, which brings our minimums up to 16, max at 25, average of about 20 points of damage per hit, looking at potentially 5 hits per round. Actually, that's gone up now. We are looking at 7 hits per round, potentially. And if we're using getting to use cleave and the like, it just keeps building and building and building. This character throws out so many attacks, and even though the damage average is lower than in comparison to the greatsword fighter build, this is still pretty significant. Assuming all 5 hits and you deal average damage each time, that's 100 points of damage on, well, it's spread out over multiple targets, possibly, but still, 100 points of damage in one round is nothing at all to sneeze at. So, going on here, we have our feats, combat reflexes, cleave, improved initiative, which is part of what boosted our initiative score there. We have dodge, which dodge, you have to designate a target, but the dodge skill gives you a +1 bonus to your armor class. Mobility, if you're pulling a move like what I described here with a person running through a threatened area, mobility gives you a +4 bonus to your defense when you do something like that. So, say this character's acrobatics score fails and they're passing through this area where people are threatening them with potential harm, they get an extra 4 points to their armor. On top of the fact that they have dodge, that's a total of +5 right there. And make it better, we have spring attack. What spring attack does, it lets you move, hit, and then move again. How exactly you move is up to you and depends a little bit on the situation, but it's handy to have, and given that you have a reach weapon in this case, it makes this character a really good skirmisher. And if you're a little bit of a power gamer or you try to do sneaky things and maybe debate points and try to persuade your DM, since you're moving in and out and you're causing targets to move in and out of your threatened area, although the feat is potentially limiting on this, I could see potentially maybe being persuaded to let a character make at least one attack of opportunity as they're darting in and out and making these attacks. But really with attacks of opportunity, what it boils down to is the target has to be moving through the threatened area, not the character moving the threatened area around them. I bring that up just because that argument's been made before with me. I've really been iffy on it. I've allowed it once or twice, I think, but that was a very specific situation. My recommendation, again, for DMs is to say no to something like this, especially if the rules is written for spring attack and attacks of opportunity. But that's just my take on it here. Of course, you're free to make your own rulings as you see fit and are comfortable with. And players, If you want to make the argument, you can. I mean, that's just what players do with their DMs. They try to persuade them into different things. Just be polite about it. Don't be a jerk. Anyways, combat expertise. What combat expertise does is it allows you to, kind of in a similar fashion to power attack, you trade off your attack bonus, but then you add a bonus to your defense based on that. So even though this character does not have as high an armor class as they possibly could, you can still have some options for increasing that and make yourself more difficult to hit. Now, next up we have Whirlwind Attack, which I do allow players to do with Spring Attack, especially if they're tumbling in and out of a melee with multiple targets. And what Whirlwind Attack does, you're only able to make a single regular attack, but you hit everything that you threaten around you. So say this character's completely surrounded, they can hit every single opponent around them in their threatened area. Now, depending on the situation, just looking at this from a DM's perspective, depending on the type of opponents or the enemies that they have, if they're completely surrounded here, they may not be able to hit everybody out here just because they've got this ring of people in the way around them. But that's situational, and as a general rule of thumb, I'd say hitting everything is typically okay, but use a little bit of common sense, use a little bit of reasonable ability, like in comparison, like, okay, so if it's a level 10 character doing this to a group of like level 1 fighters, rogues, or whatever weak monsters there are, sure, why not? Why not let them just hit everything around them? That's fine. But if they're facing equally skilled opponents and they're totally surrounded like that, then, you know, it's not unreasonable to assume that they're only going to be affecting the immediate vicinity around them rather than the entirety of the area that they could threaten with their pole arm. But what I would say is that with Whirlwind Attack, it's an attack. They can use Cleave with it, so they can make the Whirlwind Attack and essentially hit twice with their weapon. How you describe that or decide to dole that out, again, up to you and the player to work that out. But I would say, just again, based on my own reading, Cleave is viable for this. The next feat is Wind Stance. And what Wind Stance does is when the character moves, they get a 20% concealment bonus against ranged attacks. What that means is that any ranged attacks made against this character, there is a 20% chance for the attack to just totally miss before deciding whether or not they've hit even happens. So it's an extra layer of defense on top of everything else that we have going on here. And in addition, we have Power Attack and Improved Trip, which Improved Trip is usable with things like Whirlwind Attack. So they could potentially be tripping everybody around them and knocking them prone. Now, I only did this build up to level 10, but Improved Trip leads into Greater Trip, and I had to cross it out here because I gave too many feats for a level 10 character. One extra feat for a level 10 character here, but with Greater Trip, characters that are tripped provoke attacks of opportunity. So it creates a situation where the character could potentially be making extra attacks against all these people after doing a tripping whirlwind attack. And even if the DM says no, characters that are knocked prone, that are getting up, unless they have a specific ability or feat that lets them do this safely, they provoke attacks of opportunity. So one way or another, this character gets to make extra attacks and deal out even more damage to their target. Now, the class abilities here have not changed because this is a fighter, unless you're going with specific character archetypes that allow different fighter abilities. They're going to be very much the same. You get bravery up to +3 for that bonus against fear. Armor training, which means the fighter moves easier in their armor. They get more of a dex bonus and they take less of a penalty to certain skills for wearing their armor. And weapon training. This is the only real difference here, is weapon training went with polearms just because, well, this character is equipped with a polearm, a spear type of weapon. So this comes in handy, giving extra chance to hit and deal out more damage. And then I selected Blades Heavy 1 just because, well, every character is going to need a backup weapon of some kind, and a heavy two-handed blade really works nicely with this strength bonus. And even if this character does not have their polearm, all these feats will still work really well with this particular build. So, that's this interesting fighter build here. Let's go ahead and go back up topside for a moment. Alright, so here we are again, back up here with me, your host, Jordan, and that was the interesting fighter build there. Now, what makes this character at least interesting to me, it's not your typical optimized build, and really, this character is built and optimized a little bit, but the damage output is lower, but there is a greater degree of hits. This was an example of making some interesting feat selections, looking for things that do synergize together really well. It's nothing that's especially broken. There are certain arguments that you can make here that players might try, and I've tried to cover some of those just based off of my own experiences DMing, or trying to argue similar things as a player myself. But this build is interesting because it's not typically what you see. Usually what you see is something that focuses on strength and constitution. In this case, this character is not either of those things. The strength is just a little bit secondary here. The real linchpin for this overall is that higher dexterity bonus and making use of the combat reflexes feat. All the other feats there just kind of work in with that. They focus a bit on mobility, providing a bit of extra defense for the character. Well, there's the mobility feat in there, and also having wind stance and spring attack. This is a character that is meant for getting into position. They can either skirmish, move into a group of enemies, and then start wailing and flailing about with their spear, cutting, slicing, hacking, dicing, just carving up the enemy as quick and as fast as possible, and with a good bit of reach there. Even better, because this is a reach weapon, and this particular weapon also has a feature called brace, meaning they can set it and brace for a charge, a cavalry charge. Well, doesn't necessarily have to be a cavalry charge. It can be any charging opponent. And when they hit, they get a damage bonus on top of everything else that's already there. So this is a character build that's able to deal with a wide variety of enemies and dart in and out and start dealing damage. If this particular build does have any weaknesses, it's, again, the lower armor class, and because of the lower constitution score, they have a lesser degree of hit points than they might otherwise have in comparison to other fighter builds that focus more on, well, having that higher constitution score and that higher strength to go along with it. So this character is not as robust. They can be put down a little bit easier than other fighter builds or barbarians or paladins or whatever, whichever kind of melee-oriented class. So a little bit easier to hit and a little bit easier to put down. But again, that feat selection there helps to try to shore up that weakness a little bit by providing some extra mobility, extra layers of defense, extra armor as they go along and play and start moving and darting in and out with the fight here. And overall, kind of what I had in my head with this was basically a character that's training to be like an elite guard or an elite spear master. Is like think of, oh gosh, just elite trained elven bodyguards, or shock troopers, or just any sort of highly trained individual. Like these, imagine a pair of these fighters built like this defending a bridge, just even a narrow bridge. There's multiple accounts of, was it not the Battle of Stirling Bridge? That was Braveheart. I'm drawing a blank on it right now, but there's a particular fight involving a number of they're Vikingers They're on a Viking raid. They're the Finnish, Norwegian descended people, Norse peoples that were in the UK, or what we now call modern UK, and they had been on successful raids and campaigns. Their leader was a claimant to the throne, and he was fighting and working hard to defeat his enemies, and they ended up being assaulted by a sizable army. Harold Hadrada, that was his name. Pretty sure. Well, Hadrada had his men retreat, but they retreated across a bridge, and they needed time for the rest of the troops to get into formation. So he had one of the berserkers get himself all hopped up and got onto that bridge with a nice solid Dane axe and just blocked the way. And this army of thousands could only approach one or two at a time, and this person with this poleaxe just hacked and murdered his way through dozens of enemies. And it was only actually stopped after one of the Norman soldiers jumped into the river, floated down, got under the bridge, and then thrust his spear up into the guy's crotch. It took a stab to the nads to put this guy down and get him to stop. But that was one character holding off an army of thousands just based off of his positioning using a pole weapon. A poleaxe in this case, but a pole weapon nonetheless that gave him a significant degree of reach and power over other enemies. Now, it should also be mentioned that again, this was a well-seasoned fighter. The berserkers were definitely, you could argue they were definitely an elite fighting force, but this is exactly what I'm picturing here. Just in this case, it's more elven grace, starting in and out fluidly, striking fast, and then moving back out to safety, rather than just raw berserker rage. But two of these fighters working in tandem, guarding a bridge to their lord's palace or castle, or defending a bridge to protect their allies' retreat, or just defending their lord, lady, or whatever type of liege in general. This is what I picture here for this. And in this case, this is a player character. This is a player character's build. This is an aspiring champion, potentially. Or this could just be, you could go with something like a Ronin, a leaderless samurai. In this case, a leaderless elite warrior of some elven lord. Lost elven lord who is now on a quest searching out revenge, trying to find the person that betrayed their lord, just driven purely by vengeance, no interest in making friends, but somewhere along the way they pick up this ragtag bunch of allies that somehow worm their way into his, not good graces, but he doesn't have utter disdain for them. He doesn't hold them entirely with contempt because they've actually helped him. Anyways, I'm just spitballing right now. This has been the interesting fighter build. I hope you have found it interesting, or at least useful. Maybe going over the feats here, as many of you players have learned something new that you can take to your 3rd edition campaigns, 4th edition, into Pathfinder. 5th edition, again, it doesn't quite sync up exactly the same, but I still hope that this has given you some ideas as to the types of characters that you can make. Something that breaks away from more traditional molds. This isn't an elf that's focused on archery. It is using a polearm to get into a melee and deal damage. Sure, they're still being agile and quick, fluid, and moving gracefully, dancing in and out of harm's way, but it's still something a little bit different from the norm that you might see, and I hope you found it interesting. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap it up there for now. I'm going to get to work on Saturday's episode for the Building Better campaign series. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's video, and once again, I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. And if you've liked today's video, please consider giving us a like or subscribe to the channel. I can always use more subscribers, more views, and more likes. And if you have been enjoying this, consider maybe sharing this with your friends or other gamers that you might know that could find this useful or interesting. But with that said, I'll go ahead and start plugging away and promoting myself for now. You all have yourselves a good night, and thank you.